Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry for my bad throat. I have been running fever also, but since I made a commitment, I wanted to keep my word. Actually, what happened was that there was a marriage ceremony in the society where we live. One of our relatives, and at the back of the society hall was the place where the food was being prepared. So what my wife did was she went there to check how the food was being done, because she had seen some ice being brought on a cycle rickshaw, and she got a little scared. And she went back to the kitchen and to see where the food was being kept and how the food was being handled, the preparation and all. And she came and told me that be a little careful about the dahi part of it, the yogurt preparation, because some ice was put there and it might have carried some contamination. And but obviously she could not carry out the entire risk assessment. She did communicate the risk to me. She tried to manage also the risk for me. We did some risk management, but not completely, and that is what you see today. So the short point was that it is impossible to check every food from farm to fork. What she saw was only at the back of the hall where the food was being prepared. So that is what we normally do at home. So it is the lady of the house. Some of the ladies sitting here would become lady of the house in due course. So the lady makes an assessment of the risk. She also communicates the risk within the house, and she also does the risk management. So unfortunately, there is no functional separation at home. It is she who does all the three parts of the risk analysis process. Whereas when we work on a national plane or in the international plane, one of the principles of risk analysis is a functional separation. So if you see, I'm only trying to draw a parallel between what happened the other day when we were eating the food and what is being done in the Codex. The Codex has laid down certain principles which are enshrined in the Green Book. Here it is, which is the Codex Procedural Manual. And at certain places, I will try and read out some of the key paragraphs which you might wish to remember. The most important part in the entire risk analysis process is how you carry out the risk assessment and what are the different steps, the 4 different steps of the risk assessment. So the first is to identify the hazard, whether it is chemical, environmental, microbiological. That is what my wife did. So she actually identified the hazards. Then the next is to characterize the hazard, the qualitative and the quantitative evaluation of the nature of the effect. So while she did partly a qualitative characterization of the hazard, but obviously at a domestic plane, it is not possible to complete this work. And then the exposure assessment, which is much more scientific, which is required to be done while setting standards. But obviously, she could not do the exposure assessment. And the last one is to characterize the risk. They evaluate the likelihood of the illness and the quantum of the illness that is likely to happen. So she did partly evaluate the likely impact or likely illness that could happen. And she cautioned me, be careful about the food, this food and that food. So while I took care of one food, the yogurt part with the ice, but probably I did not care about the other. So that characterization of the risk is also a very important factor in the entire risk analysis process. So the Codex has identified, the FAO and WHO have identified the risk assessment bodies, which is JECFA, JMPR, JEMNU, and JEMRA. These are expert bodies that assess the risk, and they provide the data. They collect the data from everywhere, from different countries. And then they, after carrying out the entire risk assessment, they make a recommendation to the relevant committee of the Codex, whether it is a pesticide residues committee or food additives committee or food contaminants committee, food hygiene committee, even now nutrition. Thank you so much. And then the committee, thank you so much, so kind of you. And then the committee takes a risk management decision. And finally, it comes to the Codex Commission, Alimentarius Commission, where a final decision on the risk management part is taken collectively. So when the risk management decisions are taken, there are several parameters on which the risk management is based. In the Codex framework, we talk. And that is what we need to look at when applying the risk management process within the country. There are there's a risk analysis, working principles of risk analysis in the framework of Codex, and there is a document which is a guidance to the governments how to apply the risk analysis process. So one needs to take care of, to examine the appropriate level of protection, which means that there should not be an unnecessary trade restriction, and the health protection should not be unjustified. So, which means that you need to take a decision which is appropriate to address the risk to the public health of the country. And when Codex frames standards, they look at this aspect as an important factor. Then they also evaluate how best practices can handle this, how to minimize the risks. That is also a risk management process. Then it is important to see whether it is technically feasible. We are not living in an ideal world. We have to evaluate whether it is technically feasible, and then whether it is economically feasible. To give you an example of the aflatoxin levels which were prescribed by the European Commission several years ago, which was highly trade restrictive. And I do recall that Mr. Kofi Annan made a statement, said the amount of money that we will have to spend to manage the risk to an extent to achieve the level of protection prescribed by the European Commission is equal to the economy of Africa. So it's impractical for us. When he made that statement, then the European Commission did review their standard and made a change. Then one also needs to evaluate the cultural and traditional practices. The traditional practices are different in different countries. And of course, at the end, it has to be the risk management option should be consistent with the national or international regulations that we have. So after you have evaluated all the risk management options, then you have to select the most appropriate combination of risk management option, which then requires surveillance, monitoring, which we heard in the morning. And at the same time, while you are managing the risk after having done the risk assessment, a communication also needs to be given or to be made to all the stakeholders, whether they are the manufacturers or the transporters or the food handlers or the person in the kitchen or the traders or the storage godown, laboratories, exporters, any kind of a stakeholder, as well as the consumers. So while my wife was doing the risk assessment and the risk management, I was the consumer whom she warned. And a system of alert is a good way of communicating the risk, which also helps in managing the risk. The European Union has set in place an excellent system of rapid alert notifications. It informs everybody about what happened. And perhaps even in India, we need to consider setting up such system. And Dr. Gonkrokta is sitting here, who is responsible for all the enforcement, so I'm sure he's listening to what I'm saying. But at the same time, while all these things are regulatory parts, it's important to build capacity. What Mr. Mohanty said in the morning, and Dr. Panandikar also mentioned, is the good agricultural practices, good manufacturing practices, good handling practices, hygienic practices, laboratory practices. All these contribute to controlling the risks, whatever may be the nature of the risk, chemical or microbiological or any other contaminant. The working principles of risk analysis given in that green book that I just showed you, which is the Codex Procedural Manual, has provided guidance to the Commission as to how to apply the risk analysis principles. And they also encouraged the different committees of the Codex Alimentarius to set up their own risk analysis policies and principles. A risk analysis principle broadly would remain the same, and there is an overarching document called the Working Principles of Risk Analysis. Based on that document, different committees have set up their own risk analysis principles. For example, the Food Additives Committee, the Food Contaminants Committee, the Pesticide Residues Committee, the Veterinary Drugs Committee, even the Food Hygiene Committee has a risk analysis policy. So there are subtle differences, but essentially the overarching document is the same. One important paragraph that I would like to read out from the risk analysis principles, the working principles of risk analysis, is section 10, which says, when there is evidence that a risk to human health exists, but scientific data are insufficient or incomplete. I'm reading out this because this can be a factor in conditions in different countries. even in Codex, in the framework of Codex, we have seen that sometimes the data is incomplete or is insufficient. In such cases, the Codex Alimentarius has a policy not to define a standard, but to lay down a code of practice to minimize the risk. And that is what is the good agricultural practices, good manufacturing practices, and the other practices. And the other element of risk analysis, the important element of risk analysis, is precaution. One can take a precautionary step. An advance alert, which my wife did the other day. So, in different committees. Generally, the different committees of the Codex Alimentarius advise the expert bodies, after identifying a contaminant, to carry out a risk assessment. And when the risk assessment is carried out, the recommendations are brought to the committee, and then the committee takes a decision. However, there are two committees, the Veterinary Drugs Committee and the Pesticide Residues Committee. Because of the nature of the contaminant, they have a slightly different approach. They first set their priorities. They decide, there's a working group of each of these two committees. They do a prioritization, and they identify different contaminants or antibiotics or growth promoters, whether we need to set a standard for these items. So before carrying out the selection, there is a set of criteria. I think in the Veterinary Drugs Committee risk analysis principles, there are 5 criteria that have been laid down. And in Pesticide Residues Committee, I think there are 4 or 5 criteria, based on which the committee decides to take that contaminant on a priority list. And after it is approved by the commission, the relevant expert body is requested to carry out a risk assessment and provide their recommendations. And then the committee takes a view, which then comes to the commission. While doing so, there is, in taking decisions on risk management, the Codex Alimentarius also considers a document which is given in the procedural manual on page 209, is the statements of principle concerning the role of science in the Codex decision-making process and the extent to which other factors are taken into account. Now, what are these other factors? We did talk about the traditional practices, the economic feasibility, the technical feasibility. But what are these other factors? These other factors we have seen, and our friends from the observer organizations would bear me out. They have been through this process. They've seen this. The other factors sometimes have taken a prominent seat in the Codex decision-making process. The discussion on other factors has been going on in the Codex Alimentarius from 1991. This document was adopted several years ago, But in the year 1999, the CCGP considered this in detail. The CCGP stands for the Codex Committee on General Principles, which lays down the policy and procedures for the Codex Alimentarius. What was agreed, what was decided, and then finally adopted by the Commission is that only those other legitimate factors can be taken into consideration which are relevant for health protection and fair trade practices. What are the other legitimate factors which were proposed for inclusion? Are animal welfare, consumer concerns, consumer choice, societal values, environmental impact. These were discussed but were not accepted as legitimate factors because these do not have a direct impact on the health of consumers. I would need to conclude now because there is another speaker and we have to conclude this session by 11:40, I think, but I will tell you an important case of a veterinary drug called ractopamine, a famous ractopamine case, which we settled in July through a vote, which is not the best way to do because the standard was adopted by a difference of only one vote, which is not really consensus. But that is how the decision was made because that is the decision-making process in the event of no consensus. There are a lot of discussions on the risk assessment, how the risk assessment was done, whether it was done properly or not, whether all the tissues of pigs were considered. China had an important issue. China and European Union said 70% of our population consumes pork, so you cannot set a standard without our consent, which is quite legitimate because the health protection is important in these two places which are essentially the consumers of pork. But then there were several other arguments for adoption of these standards, saying JECFA has done the evaluation 3 times, and each time they have come up with a similar risk assessment and a recommendation. It wasn't easy to find consensus. We tried very hard, but at the end, it came to a vote. Last year in 2011, the Commission decided that no, we will not vote. We will go by consensus, but this time they finally did the voting and it was adopted. A very brief word about what is likely to come up in the near future. And we are working on a new Codex strategic plan, which is going to hopefully will be adopted. It has to be adopted in July 2013 so that it comes into effect from 1st January 2014. So it is for a 6-year period from 2014 to 2019. What are the major issues that are going to come up? And that has been included in the Codex strategic plan on the analysis part, risk analysis part of it. The Codex is going to evaluate the emerging risks, the new risks that are likely to come up. And nutrition has been specifically added this year. So there are several risks on account of malnutrition or other non-communicable diseases, related nutrition issues related to non-communicable diseases. Now, these are the things which are emerging, And another most important thing that is emerging and which will be discussed in the Codex once the new strategic plan is adopted is the effect of climate change on food safety. Climate change has an effect on several things, and it has an impact on food safety as well. So the countries would do well to start thinking on those lines, including India, as to what are the likely impact of climate change on food safety and, of course, the nutritional aspects. And along with that, it is extremely important to build capacity, to create more awareness about the risk and risk assessment and risk management. And since agriculture starts from the ground, perhaps the best way to start risk management is to implement good agricultural practices and good manufacturing practices. This is, in short, about what Codex is working on in the risk analysis process, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.